The Soviet Union, one of history's greatest superpowers, was born amid the fire and chaos of the Russian Revolution of 1917. After the fall of the Tsarist regime, Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks to power, carrying the dream of a classless society where workers and peasants controlled their own destiny. Yet, from the very beginning, this dream harbored seeds of instability. In its early years, the Soviet Union faced a brutal civil war. The Bolsheviks, or Red Army, battled the White Army, a coalition of Tsarist loyalists, counter-revolutionaries, and even foreign interveners from the West. By 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics (USSR) was officially established, uniting Russia and neighboring republics into a colossal political entity. Lenin, with his sharp vision but declining health, laid the foundation for a centralized political system. After his death in 1924, Joseph Stalin emerged as his successor. Stalin's policies of rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization transformed the Soviet Union into an industrial powerhouse, but at a horrific cost. Millions perished in the Ukrainian famine, Holodomor, and political purges eliminated anyone suspected of being an enemy of the people. This brutality not only consolidated Stalin's power, but also sowed deep-seated fear throughout society. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union became a closed state, with a propaganda machine working tirelessly to glorify the achievements of socialism. Behind the Iron Curtain, however, discontent simmered. Despite promises of a utopia, citizens often queued for hours to buy basic necessities. The centralized planned economy, while effective for building heavy industry, failed to meet consumer demands. The seeds of dissatisfaction were planted here, though it would take decades for them to sprout. World War II marked a turning point. The Soviet Union suffered staggering losses, with over 20 million deaths. But its victory over Nazi Germany cemented its status as a global superpower. Stalin capitalized on this triumph to expand influence, establishing pro-Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe and creating a divide between East and West. The Cold War began. Yet, even in the glow of victory, cracks in the system emerged. Citizens began to question, why, despite the triumph, was life still so hard? After World War II, the Soviet Union entered a new confrontation, the Cold War with the United States. This was not a conventional war of bullets and bombs, but a race of economics, military might, technology, and ideology. The Soviet Union invested heavily in its military, nuclear weapons, and space program, achieving historic milestones like the launch of Sputnik in 1957 and Yuri Gagarin's flight in 1961. These feats stunned the world, but masked a grim reality. The Soviet economy was stretched to its limits. To maintain its superpower status, the USSR allocated 20 to 25% of its GDP to military spending by the 1980s. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens faced shortages of food, consumer goods, and housing. Stores in Moscow were often empty, forcing people to rely on black markets for basics like jeans or Western music cassettes. The contrast between the Soviet Union's glittering international image and the domestic struggles grew stark. In Eastern Europe, satellite states like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia showed signs of unrest. In 1956, an uprising in Hungary was brutally crushed by Soviet tanks. Similarly, the 1968 Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia was suppressed. These events damaged the USSR's international image and deepened discontent within the Eastern Bloc. People there craved not only political freedom, but also the allure of Western lifestyles, rock music, Hollywood films, and abundant consumer goods. Domestically, after Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev initiated a thaw. He denounced Stalin's crimes and relaxed some repressive policies. However, Khrushchev's reforms were superficial. The planned economy remained flawed, and ethnic minorities from Ukraine to the Baltics began to simmer with resentment. These groups felt oppressed by Russian dominance, and nationalist sentiments slowly emerged. Under Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union entered a prolonged period of stagnation. Brezhnev maintained power through a vast bureaucracy, but stability came at the cost of stagnation. The economy faltered, corruption spread, and public morale waned. Meanwhile, the Cold War drained resources, with proxy conflicts in Vietnam, Angola, and Afghanistan further depleting the treasury. The war in Afghanistan, starting in 1979, became an unhealing wound as the USSR bogged down in a prolonged guerrilla conflict. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up its communist government against insurgents. What was intended as a swift military operation became a strategic disaster. Afghanistan turned into the Soviet Vietnam, draining both the economy and national morale. Despite its modern equipment, the Soviet military struggled against the guerrilla tactics of the Mujahideen fighters, supported by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. The Mujahideen used Afghanistan's rugged terrain to their advantage. Thousands of Soviet soldiers died, and images of zinc coffins returning home eroded public faith in the regime. At home, the Afghan war became a symbol of systemic failure. Mothers mourned lost sons, veterans returned with physical and psychological scars, and tales of wartime brutality spread. Meanwhile, the war's costs exacerbated the economic crisis. Resources meant for improving living standards were funneled into a seemingly pointless conflict. The war also damaged the Soviet Union's international standing. Non-aligned nations, which once viewed the USSR as a counterweight to Western imperialism, began to turn away. Even within the Eastern Bloc, resistance movements drew inspiration from the Afghan defiance. By 1989, when Soviet troops withdrew, Afghanistan was not just a military defeat, but a symbol of the USSR's weakening grip. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. At 54, he was the youngest Soviet leader since Stalin, bringing hope for change. Gorbachev recognized that the USSR could not sustain its stagnation. The economy was crumbling, society was restless, and the arms race with the US was pushing the country toward bankruptcy. He introduced two revolutionary policies: perestroika restructuring and glasnost openness. Perestroika aimed to reform the economy by reducing state control and encouraging private initiatives. Cooperatives were allowed, and some state enterprises gained autonomy. However, these reforms were slow and poorly coordinated. Managers, accustomed to central planning, struggled in a market-like environment. Production plummeted, inflation soared, and shortages worsened. Glasnost allowed unprecedented freedom of speech. The press exposed corruption. Citizens openly criticized the government, and historical events like Stalin's crimes were debated publicly. But this openness was like lifting the lid off a pressure cooker. Long-suppressed grievances erupted, from nationalist movements in the Baltics to protests in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev also shifted foreign policy, seeking to ease tensions with the West and signing nuclear arms reduction treaties with the US. However, these efforts weakened the USSR's superpower status. Eastern European nations, sensing Moscow's loosening grip, demanded independence. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, marking the end of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. At home, Gorbachev faced opposition from both conservatives, who wanted to preserve the old system, and radicals like Boris Yeltsin, who pushed for faster democratization. The Soviet Union, built on centralized control, began to fracture under the weight of Gorbachev's own reforms. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was a massive but outdated machine. The centralized planned system, once key to rapid industrialization, had become a burden. Factories produced low-quality goods that failed to meet market needs, while production quotas were often falsified to appease superiors. Under Gorbachev, perestroika's economic reforms backfired, loosening state control through enterprises into chaos, as managers lacked the skills to compete in a new environment. Inflation skyrocketed, and shortages became dire. Citizens queued for hours to buy bread, meat, or even toilet paper. Meanwhile, the black market thrived, with Western goods like jeans becoming symbols of a better life. Oil exports, a cornerstone of the Soviet economy, collapsed as global oil prices plummeted in the mid-1980s. The USSR lacked foreign currency to import goods, and factories ran out of raw materials. Military spending and aid to allies like Cuba and Vietnam further drained the budget. Citizens, long promised a bright future, lost faith in the system. Strikes erupted, notably among Siberian coal miners. Workers, once hailed as the backbone of the revolution, now openly defied the regime. The Soviet Union's social cohesion unraveled as people realized the Soviet dream was an illusion. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic state, home to over 100 ethnic groups across a vast territory. Under Stalin, minorities were suppressed and forced to assimilate into Russian culture. but under glasnost, long-repressed grievances erupted. The Baltic states Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia led the charge for independence. In 1988, Estonia declared national sovereignty, a bold first. Lithuania and Latvia followed suit. These movements demanded not only political freedom but also the revival of suppressed cultures, languages, and histories. Mass protests, like the 1989 Baltic Chain, where millions formed a 600 km human chain, became powerful symbols of the quest for freedom. Elsewhere, in Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia, nationalist movements also surged. Ethnic conflicts flared, such as between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. The Soviet Union, once proud of its unity of nations, faced disintegration from within. Gorbachev tried to preserve unity with a new federal treaty, but the republics no longer trusted Moscow. Boris Yeltsin, leader of the Russian Republic, openly supported their right to self-determination, further undermining Gorbachev. By 1991, disintegration seemed inevitable. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was a historic moment, signaling the end of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. For decades, countries like East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were under Moscow's tight control. But under glasnost, democratic movements gained momentum. In Poland, the Solidarity trade union, led by Lech Wałęsa, became a powerful opposition force. In 1989, Poland held its first free elections, and Solidarity won overwhelmingly. Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing thousands of East Germans to flee west. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution peacefully brought Havel to power. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev refused to use military force to suppress these movements. While praised in the West, this decision was seen as weakness at home. As Eastern European nations declared independence, the USSR lost its strategic buffer and international prestige. The Berlin Wall, once a symbol of the Cold War, was reduced to rubble, along with the dream of a unified Eastern Bloc under Soviet leadership. In August 1991, a group of hardline Communist Party, military, and KGB officials staged a coup to overthrow Gorbachev. Fearing his reforms would dismantle the Soviet Union, they placed him under house arrest in Crimea and declared a state of emergency. The coup collapsed swiftly. Boris Yeltsin, now president of the Russian Republic, stood atop a tank in Moscow, rallying citizens to resist. Tens of thousands took to the streets, defying the coup leaders. The military, unwilling to confront the public, backed down, and the coup failed within 3 days. This event was the final blow to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his authority was shattered. Yeltsin emerged as a national hero, while the Communist Party lost all credibility. Republics, from Ukraine to Kazakhstan, declared independence. By late 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist in all but name. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on television to announce his resignation. The red hammer encycle flag was lowered at the Kremlin, replaced by Russia's tricolor. The Soviet Union officially dissolved, leaving 15 independent nations, with Russia as the primary successor. The collapse was not sudden but the culmination of multiple factors: economic stagnation, nationalist unrest, Cold War pressures, and Gorbachev's half measures. The republics, once forced into the USSR, now chose their own paths. Some, like the Baltics, quickly integrated with the West, while others descended into economic and political chaos. Soviet citizens faced a new reality. Freedom came, but with it inflation, unemployment, and instability. Many grew nostalgic for the Soviet-era's stability, however repressive it was. Russia, under Yeltsin, struggled to find its place in a post-Cold War world. The collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the 20th century's defining events, marking the end of an ideology that shaped the world. Its legacy persists. In Russia, Vladimir Putin, who called the USSR's dissolution the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, seeks to restore Russian influence. Meanwhile, nations like Ukraine and Georgia still face tensions with Russia, as if the Soviet shadow lingers. What lessons does the Soviet collapse offer? No system, however powerful, can endure without public consent. Repression may maintain order temporarily, but it cannot stop the tides of change. Reforms, if poorly executed, can lead to chaos rather than progress. Today, the Soviet Union stands as a story of ambition, power, and the fragility of grand dreams. It reminds us that history is not a straight line, but a series of choices, mistakes, and defining moments.